When it comes to Trump's public image in the aftermath of his criminal conviction in New York, there isn't enough lipstick in the Western Hemisphere to cover up that particular pig. But Republican lawmakers are giving it a try anyway, for Trump's sake. Yes, but mostly for theirs. USA Today calls it the summer of Trump for the House of Representatives, wherein Republicans jockey and jostle just for a chance to be noticed by the disgraced ex-president in all his pathological vanity. And they're doing so by flooding the docket with symbolic and humiliating flatteries. Take Paul Gosar. Earlier this month, he introduced a bill that would require the U.S. Treasury start printing $500 bills again for the first time in 79 years with Trump's face on them. Maybe his mugshot would do the trick. Who knows? At least it would be a more economical way for Trump to pay off the $454 million judgment in his civil fraud trial. It doesn't stop there, though. A Florida congresswoman recently promoted a bill that would award Trump the Congressional Gold Medal for his, wait for it, foreign policy positions. And then there's what they want to name after him. One such bill having to do with the United States Coastal Exclusive Economic Zone, an area more than 4 million square miles larger than our country's total landmass. All of this just to get a attaboy or attagirl from a convicted felon. Joining our conversation, former GOP advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain, creator of The Circus, Mark McKinnon is here. Ruth is still with us. Mark, I quoted John McCain in the last block because in covering Trump's affection for Vladimir Putin, I just always wish he were around to smack some sense and reality into his old Republican Party. And I wonder what you think when you watch how quickly the party has sort of devolved into autocrat worship.
Exactly right. I think about McCain all the time and how we miss his voice and we miss his spine. And, you know, it's not surprising to most of us what Trump does or thinks. What's shocking is the extent to which the entire Republican Party has rolled over. And they're about out of shoe polish right now from all the genuflecting and bootlicking that's going on. You know, I remember joking with my circus colleagues when we were at the White House when Trump was initially elected and we were in front of the White House, and one of them mentioned jokingly this notion that Trump would emblazon across the front of the White House his gold logo. Now it doesn't seem like so much of a joke. You know, yeah. I'm sure that people out there thinking about putting him on Mount Rushmore and beyond to some of the examples that you mentioned. But the interesting thing to me, and the really depressing thing, Nicole, is that the price of entry into Trump world today is not support, it's not being smart, it's not being experienced. It is the level to which you will humiliate yourself. And loyalty isn't enough. You have to be humiliated in order to really rise in the ranks of Trump world.
Well, I mean, McKinnon, you know some of these people. I mean, you know, Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene aren't what threaten the democracy. I mean, Paul Gosar's relatives were on this program warning us about him. It's the Rob Portmans, it's the Mitch McConnells, it's the John Cornyn's, it's the people who know better. Take me inside their psychology. Why are they on the side that threatens our democracy?
Well, I mean, you can count on one hand the number of people that have kept their principles. I mean, Liz Cheney's one of them, and just a few others. You're right. Everybody has folded. And again, the really depressing thing is to recognize that the human condition, which apparently when it comes to when it gets down to it, cares more about power than principle. You know, Republicans have just simply abandoned any sense of principle on issues that have been the hallmark of the Republican Party, on foreign policy, standing up to Putin, anti-trade barriers, and all those sorts of things, just thrown out the window. And it doesn't matter to these people because they care more about being in Trump's favor, and which means being potentially in power in Congress.
You know, Ruth, it is one of the most autocrat-adjacent behavior patterns, the obsession with the flattery, the warm welcome to the scene of the crime. I mean, these people ran. They're on video running and hiding on January 6th from Trump's supporters in an insurrection incited by Trump. And the fact that they opened their arms to him after running from his supporters in an insurrection he incited is something that requires all of us to stop and ask why. Tell me what kind of marker it is, what mile marker it is on the path toward autocracy.
You need that to have autocracy, because and what all the things Trump is doing, requiring, I call it ritual humiliation, and all dictators do it to their elites, because they pit them against each other so that they can compete to see who is most loyal and who can grovel the best, preferably on camera. And that's because authoritarianism requires you betray others, like you look away as your neighbor gets deported, but above all, that you betray yourself, that you have a kind of moral collapse, and that everything is done for the leader and you can't even stand up for yourself. That's the sickness, the sadism of these people like Trump. And so forcing the Republicans to run for their lives, to call their loved ones on January 6th because they thought they weren't going to make it, and then making them, or them doing it themselves, acclaiming him after and forgetting, quote, and not being able to speak about that trauma is a sign of this moral collapse. And that's what you need to have autocracy. So it's very frightening. But it's out of the strongman playbook.
What, Ruth, if anything, breaks the cycle?
That's a good question. Sadly, in the past, where you have a real regime like fascist regimes, it actually took being bombed by the Allies for the personality cults of Mussolini and Hitler to start to shrivel. And people started, there's, police records that people started only in 1942, 43, denouncing the leader out loud because they lost their fear. They didn't care anymore. Now, it's very sad because it's an easy fix in one way that they have to band together against Trump, because polling is showing that he's less popular with his being a convicted felon. It's a liability for him. And so the path is clear. It's so sad they didn't get off the Trump highway to hell on January 7th, and Mike Pence could have led them there. But that's the recipe. And otherwise, if he comes back into the White House, it's really much more difficult.
License to a convicted felon to use his platform, one of the biggest in the world, to attack, intimidate, and threaten is a bridge too far for the highest court in the state of New York, even if that convicted felon is the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, with a debate on his schedule in less than 10 days. The New York Court of Appeals early this morning dismissing the disgraced convicted ex-president's latest bid to lift that gag order in the hush money election interference case. So what does this mean? Well, right now, Donald Trump is still legally prohibited from attacking witnesses, prosecutors, jurors, court staff, and their family members. Judge Juan Merchan has already found Donald Trump to be in violation of the gag order 10 times, and the 11th could land him in jail, as the judge has already warned publicly. New York court refusing to hear Trump's appeal, quote, upon the grounds that no substantial constitutional question is directly involved. Or as our friend Joyce Vance puts it, quote, in other words, convicted felon Donald Trump's First Amendment rights are not violated by the order. It's a rebuke, of course, to Team Trump, which has argued that the appeal involved, quote, substantial constitutional questions of the highest importance. The appeal dismissed today was part of a desperate kitchen sink political approach to getting the gag order lifted. And there's an important reason for that. There's nothing the only presidential candidate running as a convicted felon wants to do more than delegitimize this entire process, the one that led to his guilty conviction. Trump has been raging against the New York case and his legal troubles over the last few days. Watch.
There's not even a case here. There's no case. And when they saw the jury instructions, when they saw all the things that happened, and it's not like anybody's a friend of mine. Mark Levin is an example. They couldn't believe it. so unfair. The President of the United States has a gag order where I'm not allowed to speak because the judge doesn't want the truth to come out.
Of course, none of that's true. He could have spoken. He could have told the truth. Decided not to. Maybe didn't think he could. But in this light, the gag order does prevent him from sinking his teeth any further into the case or people involved in it. In this case, according to one recent poll by Politico, has turned off a sizable, potentially decisive chunk of voters. It should be no surprise then that Trump's attorneys are trying anything and everything to end the gag order, even writing to Judge Juan Merchan, arguing that Trump is owed special consideration because he's running for president. To that, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said that the trial ending does not mean everyone's out of the woods just yet. Donald Trump's journey through New York's criminal justice system has only just begun. Prosecutors telling Judge Merchan this, quote, "The court has an obligation to protect the integrity of these proceedings and the fair administration of justice, at least through the sentencing hearing and the resolution of any post-trial motions. The ex-president is set to be sentenced on July 11th. Donald Trump remaining under a gag order limiting what he can say in the historic hush money election interference case that resulted in his guilty conviction is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is back with us. Also joining us, chief political columnist and host of the podcast Impolitique for Puck. MSNBC National Affairs analyst John Heilman's back. Former SDNY Criminal Division Deputy Chief MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg's back, and writer and editor for Protect Democracy, Amanda Carpenter, is back. Vaughn Hilliard, I am always astounded by Trump's ability to analyze a poll that's bad for him. And the worst poll for him is the number of independents that, one, believe the facts of this case, two, believe he's guilty. Hello to whoever's dog is joining us. I'm sorry you didn't get an intro. And the idea that Trump wants to lift the gag is so, we're in year 9 and we're so accustomed to, well, of course he wants to attack the prosecutors. He wants to attack the prosecutors to help his campaign. That's some sick stuff.
Right. When we're talking about the polls, Nicole, I think that there is plenty of reason to be concerned about the underlying numbers. If you're Joe Biden's campaign or Donald Trump's campaign, when you're looking at the head-to-head matchup. But the one thing that I constantly look at with the polls is shifts that we see, because I think that that is at least a baseline number that we can compare on a timeline to one another. And what you have seen coming out of the guilty verdict is a shift among particularly independents away from Donald Trump. And if you are his camp, this should be of paramount concern. It was independents or reticent conservatives who really shifted the entire dynamic of the 2020 race and what was a narrow outcome in Joe Biden's favor here. And so for Donald Trump, he is quick to highlight the polls that are showing him up in favor. But when you're looking at these sort of polls, these are difficult realities, and especially when you have agreed to go in a one-on-one matchup at a debate on June 27th, which we're now just 9 days away from. This is a moment here where having the gag order remain in place means that you are not able to effectively undercut something that clearly voters have atop their mind and feel is a vulnerability for you and your campaign.
I mean, Heilman, it's an important reveal, I think, of Trump's constant shoving all of this through a political sieve. I mean, there really isn't, because his legal strategy has always been a political solution, right? His legal solution to all of his criminality and criming has always been to be president again, just pardon himself and prosecute and jail the state prosecutors where he can't pardon himself. And I think what's remarkable and what our team talked about today is, I love J.B. Pritzker saying yesterday, we're all in the pot. We're all in the pot. It's been such a slow boil. We're so accustomed to him attacking the rule of law, attacking prosecutors, attacking anyone that threatens him legally, that we don't always sort of stop and, why does he want to be out of the gag order? Why does he want to be able to attack Judge Juan Merchan and Michael Cohen? Because the things they testified to damage him.
Well, I think it's clearly the case. That's clearly the case, Nicole. There's no doubt that the Trump team is looking at although they're not acknowledging, and in fact, often saying the opposite. They're looking at the same sets of numbers that the Biden campaign is looking at, and that you can see in the public polling, which is not that this guilty verdict has won the race for Joe Biden by any stretch, and not that anybody, not in any definitive way, even proves that any votes will be changed by it by the time we get to November. But they have seen the unknown that we had faced. Which, what if a former president gets convicted? What if he gets convicted on all the counts he's been charged with? What will happen to public opinion? What we've seen is a small, but in a race that's, as I say over and over again, it's a margin of error race that's going to be won on the margins, won or lost on the margins. And so in a small and potentially decisive sliver of voters, it has moved the needle for now. They see that as clearly as I said, everybody else does. And so, yes, I mean, they want to discredit, to try to get those numbers back under control. They'd rather throw as much doubt on the verdict as possible. The verdict, throwing the most direct place to throw doubt on the verdict is to throw it at the jurors and to throw it at the court and to throw it at the judge. And that's what's been Trump's strategy all along. It's also the case that they know that several things now are going to happen that could worsen his position politically. One of them, we see this also in the polling, is that a jail sentence, whether it's deferred or immediate, much more likely deferred than immediate, but a prison sentence hurts him in the polls, drives home the severity of the crimes. And he is going to appeal. But between now and November, a sweeping guilty verdict backed with potentially a significant penalty is bad for him politically, and he wants to get as early a start as possible in trying to discredit everything about that so that he can gain back what small but crucial ground he seems to have lost in the polling because of this outcome.
Yeah, I mean, Amanda, I just think back to the, it's hard to have a lot of memories of the Republican primary because it was so hapless, it was so uninspired, and it was so short. But I remember learning that I think it was Chris Christie's campaign had polling data that showed just what's come to bear, just what John and Vaughn are talking about, that among the voters that each side is fighting to swing over by November, they're late deciders, they're consumers of news. They engage late, and they care very much about a guilty conviction, especially on these facts. This is the only case of the four that Trump doesn't talk about on the stump. He brags about stealing classified stuff, so he's talking about the PRA, Presidential Records Act. He's now calling the insurrectionists from January 6th warriors. He doesn't ever talk about his, collusion with David Pecker to smear Ted Cruz. He talks about the others as an asset. He knows these facts are terrible for him politically.
Yeah, I think he does recognize that, but he's also a person, I think we've all learned, who doesn't look at the polls and then decide how to calibrate his position. He takes a position and then tries to bend reality to it. And I think you see that in his pushing back against these gag orders. And for the record, I don't like that they're called gag orders because it plays into the narrative that he is promoting, that he's being somehow unconstitutionally, unfairly gagged by a system that's being weaponized against him. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done exactly explaining what these gag orders are meant to do. All they're essentially, in a nutshell, designed to do is to make sure that he doesn't foment violence against the process, against the judges, the jury, the prosecutors, et cetera, to keep the process safe. And that is not a high standard for anyone, let alone someone who is a presidential candidate. But what really worries me, Nicole, is that I don't see just Donald Trump making that argument. Earlier today, there was a news story that a couple dozen Republican state attorneys general, people who in red states are supposed to be the keepers of law and order, sent a letter essentially decrying Jack Smith pursuing a gag order when it came to the classified documents case. And so I think that the smart set politically around Trump, who's trying to bend this reality to his insane argument, are saying, you know what, we're just going to look past the hush money trial. We're going to go against these gag orders on these other cases, and going into the convention, going into sentencing, talk about how this is just more evidence that he is having the justice system unfairly weaponized against him. That is false, but I fully expect that is what is going to happen. People need to be prepared to push back against that and explain these orders are designed to keep the system safe. And he is free to speak, but he is not free to foment violence like we saw in the other presidential debate he had with Joe Biden, where he had the famous quote where Chris Wallace asked him, will you denounce the Proud Boys? And he called him up stand back and stand by.
Another day, another Trump insider staffing up criminal defense lawyers. Another member of Team Trump facing legal trouble today. It's Trump advisor Boris Epshteyn. He's been arraigned in Arizona for his role in setting up fake slates of electors so that Donald Trump could overturn the will of the people and successfully steal the 2020 presidential election. Trump jokingly refers to him as, quote, my psychiatrist, and a former Trump lawyer who tried to stop the Trump coup plot called him a, quote, idiot, end quote. Whatever you want to call him, Boris Epshteyn is one of 51 Trump allies facing charges for attempting a coup in America. And of course, there's Donald Trump himself, a convicted felon for hiding a plot to interfere in the 2016 election and facing felony charges at the federal and state levels for trying to interfere in the 2020 election. But all that, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Trump world's criminal culpability. There's criminality literally lurking in every stage of Trump's public life. Trump's former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, is currently in prison for perjury. His former trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is in prison for contempt of Congress. His former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is facing a 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. His former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, faces felony charges in 2 states, along with his ex-lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani is also facing fire from a federal judge who scolded him in court yesterday for his failure to comply with his bankruptcy case. He was forced to file for bankruptcy after a court ordered him to pay $148 million in damages to the 2 Georgia election workers he defamed. We are back with Vaughn, John, Amanda, and Christy. John Hallman, before we went to break, I asked you to think about how we should cover the debate and what you think Trump has planned for the debate and whether you think there's any chance they'll commit to not inciting violence, another stand back and stand by moment.
Well, I don't think that Trump's going to pre-commit to doing anything, Nicole. And I, because he's Trump, he would claim that he never incited violence to begin with. So it's like it's a really a hollow commitment if he made it. I guess I'd say 3 things. One, the Trump campaign and Donald Trump, despite what we were talking about earlier in the hour about the impact, the electoral impact of the guilty verdict here, they think they're winning this race. Their confidence is not made up. They think they're ahead. And I think from your days in campaigns, if you thought you were ahead and you were managing Donald Trump's campaign, and you were now going to get to this big audience, this big non-cable news audience, not the political junkies, but to the normies out there who don't pay much attention to politics, you would be pleading with Donald Trump, please, just be boring, be dull, don't try to score points. You just need a prevent defense, I'll use a football analogy, or a 4 corners offense to use a basketball analogy. Just look like you're not a lunatic in this race. And I think that if you were running Donald Trump's campaign, you would be thinking about, those I know you have dogs, right? I know you have dogs. You have those little pill pockets. You take the little peanut butter pill pocket. If you have to give your dog a drug, you put the peanut butter wrapped around it. If I were running the Trump campaign, I'd be thinking about a little slug of Thorazine inside one of his hot dogs right before the debate. Because if you could get him to calm down, that would be what you'd want if you were Chris LaCivita. You're not going to probably get that, though. And I think the media question is really important. And our friend George Stephanopoulos is right to say that the first question, employing a little bit of prerogative on the part of all of us from the cheap seats here, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash have a tough job that night. But the first question has to be who won the 2020 election. And then there's the question that they're going to have a tough job that night doing this thing live with the mute buttons and all that other stuff. The real question, to your point, is what happens after. And I think there are a lot of things you can do to cover this debate. But here's the most important thing that the media at every level has to not do, which is to do that. There's no public event in politics that's more prone to false equivalencies than a debate. It's literally, we write about them and talk about them as if it's a boxing match. And so you look down the chart, you're a boxing judge. It's like, well, Biden scored here and Trump scored there and he threw that punch and he got that jab in and then there was that moment, there was this moment. The media has to apply a value judgment to did Joe Biden stumble a little bit? Did Donald Trump get in a good zinger here or there? those are irrelevant questions. There have to be people we have to make evaluative judgments about not just how many lies Trump told and fact-checking them, but on the things that matter most. What were the two candidates saying about democracy, about institutions, about the rule of law, and what were they saying they're going to do in the future, and what were they not saying? This is a huge challenge, because the easiest thing in the world is for the media to grade this thing like a prize fight. And it's not a prize fight, because not all punches are created equal, and not all punches land with the same force, and no one is probably going to be laying splat out in the ring, but there are going to be things that matter a lot more than other things in this debate, and the media must focus on the things that matter in judging this debate and choosing what to show.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably no more important conversation to have in the next 9 days. So let's have this one instead of anything else we're going to talk about. Amanda Carpenter, say a little more about how this should start and the frame that we should put around. Well, it could end up being the only debate, depending on how it goes for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think John is spot on in talking about the things that Donald Trump may want to accomplish. Like, listen, his aides may tell us, like, oh, he's going to be a good boy and stick to a good script and have a robust policy debate. Yeah, I've heard that line before. I don't think Donald Trump is going to go into the script. I think he's going to go in with ideas and things, a couple things he wants to accomplish. Number one, above anything else, because we know this, we've witnessed him over the last few years, he approaches every interaction as an exercise in power dynamics. I win, you lose. I'm strong, you're weak. And I think he's going to go in there with two targets in mind. It's not just President Biden. It is the debate moderators. And I know Jake and Dana are well equipped. They'll do a great job. But Donald Trump is going to go in with that kind of mindset. I have two targets to beat here. And what I think that involves is telling the first big election lie and adhering to it, and that the election was rigged and stolen, as he's pretty much done in every media appearance since January 6th, correct? And then there's the second big lie, which underpins this election, and that the justice system is being unfairly weaponized against him. And then I just think he'll sprinkle on, if we're really preparing for the worst and the most turbulent debate, some stuff about Hunter Biden to try to knock Biden off his game. Because, again, going into this season, Donald Trump only cares about looking as strong as possible against Biden. And this man is more practiced than any presidential candidate in history when it comes to performing on television. I've seen a number of commentators talk about how they think Donald Trump will skip the debate, or he'll be rattled by the fact that there's a lack of a television audience. I don't buy either of those things, because I've seen The Apprentice. I've seen him take over almost every TV interview he's been in when it's just him and an interviewer and no one else but a camera. He knows how to do this. And so if Joe Biden is not preparing for the absolute worst and the torrent of fire hose of lies, and have some kind of a response to support the rule of law, to talk about the convictions with a very clear target in mind of what those responses will be, in a way that he doesn't look rattled, he doesn't look tired, he doesn't look unresponsive, that has to be Joe Biden's goal. I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't toss off this debate at all. And the fact that it's the first one so early in the year, that just gives a longer runway if Donald Trump has that kind of performance to set in that narrative over the summer months.
Vaughn, it's such a good exercise in reminding us of the reality of Trump as a candidate. I mean, the reality is that the way he survived the Access Hollywood tape was by going to the debate, I think it was a day later, and in the eyes of his own campaign and in his mind and in the minds of his supporters and the people who voted for him, somehow managing to turn everything around and get his campaign on offense. Now, I found it appalling and below the belt, but that is a known about Donald Trump. Where does your mind go in thinking of all that is possible about Donald Trump in this debate?
I think jumping off of what you just said, Amanda just said, and what John just said, is the tangents that Donald Trump goes on. Number one, he doesn't like pushback here in the year of 2024, right? It was a bygone era that he enjoyed, quarreling with the media or quarreling with his political opponents. There's a reason he didn't go on the debate stage with the other Republican presidential candidates during the primary. He wanted to avoid being called out for not only his record within the administration, but also the events around January 6th. sick, so he avoided going on the debate stage. And then you look at the fact he hasn't done mainstream TV interviews, and that's clear for the reason he has avoided having to answer direct questions. And that is where the difficulty, I think, is going to be for Joe Biden, because when you're talking about Donald Trump and claims that he makes, a lot of them are unexplainable, right? When he goes and says, right, that war would not have happened with Israel, Hamas wouldn't have attacked Israel if I was in office, or if Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if I was in office. Those are tough things to explain or try to push back on, because it takes time, it takes seconds, it takes minutes to understand or explain to the public at large. And this is the reality that Joe Biden is going to have to deal with, because many of the claims that he is going to make about whether it's the economy or employment or black and Latino employment, they're just not rooted in facts. And so Joe Biden is going to have to make the conscious decision of how much does he do explaining to the American public why Donald Trump is making claims that are not real versus trying to make his own point about what a second Biden administration would look like.
And at a very young age, he was able to assume power. He was able to do it. So obviously, he's a pretty smart cookie. The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. President Xi of China, Putin, Kim Jong-un, all of these leaders are at the top of their game. Mentally, they're at the top of their game.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in the East. No one is on the receiving end of Trump's praise quite like the dictators Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. Literally nobody doesn't have anything that nice to say about anyone else. The criminally convicted, disgraced ex-president has so much affection and praise and love and admiration for the murderous autocrats that it must be upsetting for him to see his two pals on the world stage break bread without him today. For the first time in more than 20 years, the Russian president has made his way to North Korea. As you can see from the banners all over Pyongyang, he got a very warm reception there, a blooming alliance that emphasizes the two leaders' isolation from the Western world, about which the New York Times reports this, quote, "The deepening relationship between the two authoritarian leaders poses a particular challenge for Washington. The United States once relied on Moscow's cooperation in its attempts to curb North Korea's nuclear and missile program. Now it faces a Kremlin intent on playing spoiler to American geopolitical interests around the world. Vladimir Putin's two-day visit comes as Russia has received support and weapons from North Korea in its ongoing brutal war in Ukraine, and North Korea wants help building up its ballistic missile program from Russia. Recent NBC News reporting suggests the coordination between the two leaders may present itself in the form of an October surprise, a spoiler to the U.S. election cycle that could benefit ex-President Trump. From that new reporting, quote, U.S. officials are also bracing for North Korea to potentially take its most provocative military actions in a decade close to the U.S. presidential election, possibly at Putin's urging, the officials said. The timing, they said, could be designed to create turmoil in yet another part of the world as Americans decide whether to send President Joe Biden or former President Trump back to the White House. Quote, "We have no doubt that North Korea will be provocative this year. It's just a matter of how escalatory it is," a U.S. intelligence official said. That's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and reporters and friends. NBC News national security correspondent Courtney Kube is here with us. She is bylined on that extraordinary new piece of reporting in NBC. Plus, former CIA director, now MSNBC senior national security analyst John Brennan's here, and professor of history at NYU, author of Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present, Ruth Ben-Ghiat joins us. Courtney Kube, take us through what you and our colleague Carol Lee are reporting.
Yeah, so, as we saw there in that excerpt from the story, there is a belief in the Biden administration that there will be more provocative military action by North Korea this year. And I have to say, historically, North Korea tends to do more, act out more militarily in an election year. But the concern among a number of Biden administration officials who we spoke with is that it could be more and more at Vladimir Putin's urging. Now, we just saw video of Vladimir Putin arriving in North Korea. As you mentioned, it was the first time in more than 2 decades that he's traveled there, but it's not the first time that they have met even recently. They got together in Russia in September. Since then, we have seen North Korea send millions of rounds of artillery shells ammunition and even missiles to Russia that have been used with effect in Ukraine. Millions of artillery shells in a conflict that, Nicole, largely has become about ammunition and attrition. So it really has made a difference there. The concern now among Biden administration officials is what comes next, if anything. Is it possible that in exchange for this large number of ammunition and equipment that North Korea has provided Russia, that Russia could provide them, North Korea, with military technology? Things like technology for ballistic missile and satellite launches, potentially even for their nuclear submarine program. But also, is Russia, as part of this burgeoning, growing alliance between the two countries, is Russia encouraging North Korea to act out more this year to essentially disrupt or cause chaos in the American elections later this year? Some of the things that officials spoke to us about are the possibility of North Korea carrying out another nuclear test, potentially sometime this fall. These are all the sorts of things that the U.S. has been looking for. But I have to say, it seems unclear what exactly Putin and Kim Jong-un are talking about during this meeting. It doesn't seem like U.S. officials are very certain. A lot of it still remains in the realm of speculation, Nicole.
I mean, Director Brennan, there is, in terms of what we know as a public, a pretty deep record of Trump's affinity for both these leaders. What, if any, nexus between sort of Trump admiring both of them and their newfound closeness exists?
Well, it's very worrisome, Nicole. Worrisome that the fact that Russia has enhanced its military relationship with North Korea, and those conventional munitions that North Korea is providing is really helping Russia on the battlefield, just like we're very concerned about Russia's developing military relationship with Iran. But this year in particular, I think is most concerning, and I do think it's prudent for the national security officials in the United States to be worried about what could happen, because this year is more important for Vladimir Putin in terms of the U.S. presidential election than the previous two. It's quite obvious to all that he has a preferred candidate in the upcoming election. He wants Trump to be back in the White House. President Biden has been a painful thorn in Putin's side over the last several years, as he has been resolute in the support against Russian aggression in Ukraine and keeping the NATO alliance together in supporting this. And so is Putin trying to think about what he can do in the run-up to the election that could, in fact, make it more difficult for the Biden administration to have to deal with yet another problem on the international stage? And so, therefore, I think our national security structure is going to be looking at what North Korea might do. As Courtney pointed out, a nuclear test, saber rattling, maybe shooting some missiles also in the direction of Guam. So there are a number of things that can happen. Yeah. But it's clear that I think Vladimir Putin is looking to do something other than just information operations, which he did in previous elections. And will he try to actually antagonize the Biden administration by getting some of these fellow authoritarian leaders to cause trouble?
You know, Ruth, when I think about the Republican Party's migration on Russia and Putin, and I think about the Republicans I work for, John McCain, describing Putin as a murderous thug, and then you listen to Trump supporters at rallies on tape collected and reporting done by my colleague, Von Hilliard. They don't think there's anything wrong with Putin. Tucker Carlson's there riding grocery carts around, talking about how beautiful Russia is. I can't fathom that the same thing would happen with North Korea, but it feels like that would be a mistake. And I wonder what role this sort of boiling of the frog, normalizing of our adversaries plays in Trump's authoritarian plot.
Well, one part is domestic, where Trump has been conditioning Americans to think that these kind of murderous leaders are actually preferable. And he's been helped by Tucker Carlson, who not so long ago said that leadership requires killing people. So he's been advertising Xi and the leader of North Korea as not only, the greatest kind of intelligent leaders, but also his buddies. And so the big picture here is that Trump is selling this idea that the world will be safer if he is president because of those relationships, the love letters to North Korea's leader. And this, of course, is his megalomania, because it implies when he says that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he were in the White House, it implies he has some sway over Putin, when in fact it's quite the opposite. But it's a deadly serious situation. because, there's too many of these people who are very invested in Trump coming back, both for geopolitical reasons, because they know he wants to withdraw from NATO and they could more easily do what they want to do. And then also for, we could say, financial reasons, that the flows of illicit money to these terroristic regimes can start up again if Trump is in the White House.
Courtney, I wonder what sort of back channels are being activated to reassure our allies in the region that America is not going to head down the same path with North Korea as Trump did with Russia.
So one thing that we've been hearing more and more over the last several months is about this strengthened and even growing relationship that the U.S. has with allies in the region, specifically Japan and South Korea. And whenever we ask about this, when Carol and I were reporting on this story over several weeks, whenever we would go to the U.S. and to administration officials and defense officials and say, how is the U.S. going to deal with this? We were consistently told, well, we're strengthening our relationships. We're showing on the world stage with partnering together for exercises. And so it seems that's the way that the U.S. is really countering this is, okay, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin want to appear together on the world stage. We'll appear with our allies at the same time, and we have this military alliance that's decades old. That seems to be the main way that we've been hearing about it. But I mean, I will say officials really are watching to see if anything comes out of this meeting between the two of them this week, because the concern is not just about could there be another transfer of additional ammunition, or could they talk about the possibility of more assets that North Korea could give to Russia for use in Ukraine. But I think there's more concern about what potential technology could be exchanged here. When you think about some of the things that North Korea has been working towards, like an intercontinental ballistic missile with a survivable reentry vehicle, right? The ability to fire a ballistic missile, nuclear capable, to the other side of the world. The concern here is that is Russia providing North Korea with something that could be a game changer? And I think that's really what the officials we're speaking to are watching out of this week.